production assistant in the other room tells me when we're on. Good afternoon and welcome to the 29th of the COVID calls, a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. These calls are held every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. My name is Scott Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today, the subject of our call is COVID-19 and public health with David Barnes and Michael Udell. We are streaming on YouTube Live. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter. Use my handle @US of Disaster. You can also hear the COVID calls recorded as podcasts. Just go to soundcloud.com and search for the COVID calls podcast. Please do help me spread the word about COVID calls and send suggestions for guests and topics, and please feel free to suggest yourself. I just want to make a small note here. I've been very pleased in the last week or so that several journalists have reached out asking for suggestions for experts in one or another area. And I am very pleased to try to serve the COVID calls to serve in that way. So if you're a journalist working on a story, or if you're a researcher looking for researchers working in similar areas, that's part of what this venue is supposed to serve. So please do reach out to me by email or by Twitter. Tomorrow, we're going to talk to journalist Virginia Heffernan. Virginia Heffernan writes for the LA Times. She's a contributing writer for Wired magazine, and she is the host of the Trump Cast on Slate, as well as being an author and cultural critic. We will talk about Trump, and we've been talking about Trump, but tomorrow we're going to focus on Trump and on the presidency. We're going to talk about governors. We're going to talk about leadership. We're going to talk about this moment in American culture and much more. A good conversation for a Friday afternoon. If there is such a thing right now, please do join us tomorrow as I talk with Virginia Heffernan on COVID calls. As of today, there are 2,682,225 confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 2,622,571 cases yesterday. 856,209 of those are in the United States, up from 839,836 yesterday. There are now a total of 47,272 deaths reported in the United States, according to Johns Hopkins, up from 46,079 yesterday. 443 of those are in the city of Philadelphia. An epidemic sweeps the city. The president and Congress leave town. The disease is poorly understood. Doctors squabble over the science, the treatments. Blame is placed on foreigners, and the burden of care falls unfairly on the shoulders of the disenfranchised, the poor, and African Americans. As the death toll mounts, some doctors, some public officials act creatively, we might even say heroically. This is 2020, but in fact, what I'm talking about is the yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia in 1793, an epidemic that killed perhaps as many as 5,000 people in a city of 50,000, if you can imagine that. It was the first city of America at that time, the capital. It was sort of like Washington, D.C. and New York City of today all rolled together into one. But what good is this story to us now? Is there something to be learned from this epidemic in the past? Have we been learning from it all along, perhaps, in these 2.25 centuries ever since then? Or is this just a parlor trick for historians? An ancient tale, a reminder that people don't seem to learn from their past mistakes. I wanted to get some perspective on our public health history and the ways that history itself, as we understand it, works and changes across time. And so I invited two public health historians to come on today when COVID calls and talk about this with me. So let me introduce them now. David Barnes teaches the history of medicine and public health in the Department of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. At Penn, he is the director of the Interdisciplinary Health and Societies major and also teaches in the MPH program. He is the author of Making a Social Disease, Tuberculosis in 19th-Century France, and The Great Stink of Paris and the 19th-Century Struggle against Filth and Germs. He also has an ongoing project on the Lazaretto quarantine station, which was used throughout the 19th century on the Delaware River outside of Philadelphia. It's the oldest surviving quarantine station in the Western Hemisphere and the sixth oldest in the world. He's part of a preservation campaign to save the Lazaretto. We'll certainly talk about that today. My second guest is Michael Udell, professor and chair of the Department of Community Health and Prevention at the Drexel Dornsife School of Public Health. He's an award-winning historian and ethicist of public health, whose work focuses on the history and ethics of genomics, the history of the race concept, and the history and ethics of autism research. Michael Udell also directs the program in public health ethics and history at the Dornsife School of Public Health. He is the author of Race Unmasked, Biology and Race in the 20th Century, and the co-author of Welcome to the Genome, a user's guide to the genetic past, present, and future. He is also an affiliated faculty member of my Department of History at Drexel University. Welcome, David Barnes, and welcome, Michael Udell, to COVIDCalls.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. Great to be here.
So I'd like to remind people, please do send your questions and get them in as early as you can, and I'll turn to your questions throughout the session today. You can send them in the chat, YouTube live chat. You can email them directly to me, sgk23@drexel.edu, or you can send them to me by Twitter, which works pretty well. Just tag @US of Disaster. So let's jump right in, and I'd like to start with the question I've been asking everyone. Let me start with you, David Barnes. How are things with you? How are things in Philadelphia?
Well, interestingly, I may have had COVID-19. Last month, I had a mild fever for a couple of days and cough with no congestion, which is unusual for me. I'm actually fairly healthy normally. And if anytime I've ever had a fever and cough, I've also had congestion, classic flu. And so this was unusual. The fever went away pretty quickly. It was never that bad. And the cough lingered, as coughs sometimes do. There was no reason to get tested. I corresponded with my primary care doctor, and she said, given my description of symptoms, et cetera, that I probably had it. In any case, I'm feeling fine. I'm quarantining outside of the city at my partner's house in Doylestown, much as 18th and 19th century Philadelphians would have, if they had the option,
right,
fled the city to seek safety outside in the country or in the high ground. And I'm, like everybody else, watching the news anxiously and alternating between utter despair and milder despair.
How are you feeling now, other than despair?
Yeah, physically, I feel fine, and like other people I know who either definitely had this disease and have recovered, or think they probably did. I feel like I should be able to do something useful and helpful, and maybe take advantage of the fact that I may have had this. But at this point, I don't see any immediate options.
Did you have this enormous fatigue that some people describe with it as well?
No, it was mild fatigue, and just your basic sort of 101 degree fever for a couple of days. It was really, it was nothing severe at all physically.
Well, if you believe the president of Purdue University, and if University of Pennsylvania follows the same path, then in the fall you will be issued some kind of a special card, and you will go back to campus as one of the survivors, and you'll be teaching in the classroom, apparently.
We'll see.
We'll see. Michael, let me turn to you.
I was just going to say, hopefully the immunity from this is long lasting, if that is the case.
Yeah.
Which we don't know yet. So I'm doing okay. It's nice to be here with you both. My family and everybody has been well through this. Had to strongly encourage family members, especially parents, to not go out, especially early on. Seems to be a not uncommon phenomenon in an older and more vulnerable age group. But I think, you know, like David, there's some despair. I think I feel certainly a whole lot of anger at the way this has been mishandled, and the fact that we're now, you know, really 6, 7 weeks into the active stage of this, and the federal response remains a mess. If I shift back to our perspective as historians, I think one of the things that's been striking for me, and I suspect that you both feel this to some degree, is just how uncanny this whole thing feels. As you know, especially for David and I, who study some of these earlier epidemics, and for you, Scott, who study disasters, watching this play out in real time, being familiar with the way in which events like this erupt and evolve. There's a familiarity to it that is uncomfortable in some ways. You know, from all of our historical actors, whether it be Benjamin Rush in 1793 and some of his compatriots from that outbreak that I suspect we'll spend a few minutes talking about, or Mary Mallon in the early 20th century and what she means for asymptomatic carriers, which there seem to be a whole heck of a lot of. I don't know if you guys saw the data out of New York today, which estimates about 22% of New Yorkers have antibodies for COVID-19. And we could go on with that list. And it's, I think, you know, one of the striking things to me was to hear people who are not historians say, how could this happen? Nothing like this has ever happened before. And, you know, I don't know, maybe we're better equipped to deal with or to have some perspective on this, given that we're historians and that we've seen these things and we've studied these things. But boy, we've got our work cut out for us if most people, you know, are totally fresh-faced to all this stuff and don't believe that, you know, infectious disease and pandemics can, you know, for better, well, for worse, be a functional part of societies for very long periods of time. Hopefully that is not the case here. Our medical technologies have evolved to a point where we are able to conduct surveillance in ways that Benjamin Rush and his compatriots could not in 1793. They didn't even know what the underlying cause of the illness was then. And hopefully we will be able to develop a vaccine and other medical interventions to decrease the burden of this disease.
Well, I think that's the right segue to start our conversation. I'd like to start by talking about some of these historical cases. And I know even treating them separately potentially does a little bit of damage to history, but let's start with that and see where we get in our conversation. You know, I started the conversation earlier talking about 1793, and Michael, you talked a bit about it just now. David, let me come to you first. 1793 yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, by the numbers, would be on the scale of 33 million people dying in America today. If something like that happened, an extraordinary disaster for the city. It's locked up in the past. Somehow it's available to us now. It's relevant. Help us understand the event a little bit, and then maybe we can talk about what we should have been taking away from it.
Well, 1793 was deeply traumatizing to the city of Philadelphia, but also to the nation as a whole, the young and much smaller nation than the one we know today. And I think it's hard for us today to appreciate the sense of loss and devastation and deep, deep psychological trauma that was left by that epidemic. And not only that epidemic, yellow fever returned to Philadelphia in 1797, and again in 1798, and again in 1799. So it's not just this one-off horrifying event. As you said, Philadelphia was the nation's capital. It was the largest city. It was the busiest seaport. It was the capital of medicine and science and culture to a great degree. And it really, the yellow fever epidemics of the 1790s raised serious doubts about the future viability of the city of Philadelphia, and indeed of large cities in North America at all. Thomas Jefferson, who was vice president during the 1798 epidemic, wrote to his friend Benjamin Rush that he hoped that the silver lining, essentially, in this epidemic would be that cities would be depopulated, and that Americans would learn the lesson that cities are terrible for civilization and for democracy. Thankfully, Jefferson's prediction was wrong, but it gives a sense of the deep and enduring trauma that even those who didn't experience those epidemics directly remembered in some sense the trauma decades after, because they lived in a world that had been shaped and defined by those epidemics.
If you try to follow those traces and lines out from the 1793 epidemic, where do you look to find them? You talked about trauma. There's such a powerful word to use in this regard, and you talk about memory. Where do you spot it? You see it in new institutions that were formed and somehow became part of the fabric of the way the city thought about safety, or you see it, where do you see that linkage across time?
Well, it's certainly visible in institutions. Philadelphia established the first permanently functioning Board of Health in the United States in 1794, immediately following the 1793 yellow fever epidemic. And it established new infrastructure in an unprecedented municipal system of water supply, beginning with the waterworks at Center Square, the site that is now City Hall, and in 1800, and then in the 1810s, a brand new neoclassical state-of-the-art waterworks on Fairmount, just outside of the city on the Schuylkill River. And those were the immediate and obvious public health consequences of the yellow fever epidemics of the 1790s. And the Board of Health operates to this day under a different name, but has been permanently functioning since 1794, responsible for protecting and improving the health of Philadelphians. As far as the psychological trauma, it's difficult to see directly. One can see in the letters and diaries of people who lived through this a sense of grief, a sense of horror and terror. Most people who had anywhere else to go fled more or less immediately, not just in 1793, but particularly those who remembered 1793 at the first sign of the yellow fever in subsequent summers left town. Of course, that meant that the wealthy and powerful fled town, and those who were left in Philadelphia were those who had nowhere else to go. So this is one among innumerable instances in history of the poor, the marginalized, vulnerable populations paying a disproportionate toll during epidemics.
So Michael, the 1793 epidemic falls hardest on those who couldn't leave. It also exposed racial fractures in a city that I think for its time, you would have to say in some measure was progressive. I mean, it's the most important city in a state that had passed a gradual slavery abolition law. It was a leader in that regard, and yet this epidemic created its own racial strife, as well as a sort of fear of the outsider, the foreigner, the French. I mean, could you say a little bit more about how these fears crystallized in that moment and maybe why they did?
Sure. So in 1793, Philadelphia had a good-sized free Black population, and that population had mixed relationships with the city. Racism was a way of life then, of course. Slavery was a part of the American fabric. And during the outbreak, leaders of the free Black community were turned to help nurse the ill. They were caretakers of the sick. They helped bury people from both the free Black community and the community more widely in Philadelphia. And Dr. Benjamin Rush who historically had, for the time, would have been considered a progressive in many ways by some, although there's certainly some controversy over his perspectives on race at that time. He turned to some of his friends in the Black community, most notably Epsilon Jones and Richard Allen, for help in this dire moment. And part of that was due because of the belief that African people and African Americans may have been immune to yellow fever. There are those who would make that argument based on the fact that they had been exposed, perhaps coming from Africa and the West Indies, and others who would have made that argument from the perspective of racial science or racial medicine, that different peoples had different vulnerabilities to different diseases based on their skin color. Nevertheless, Allen and Jones rose to the occasion and understood what they were being called on to do and why, and helped the city in a very difficult and dangerous moment in our history. I think one of the things that is striking is the selflessness of that moment, especially given the racism that was such a part of the cities and the national culture at the time. And yet racism was still a part of that response, and other city leaders besides Rush attacked Jones, Allen, and other free Blacks for taking advantage of the situation, for charging extra for disposing of bodies and other things that were slanderous and untrue. So racism was baked into the system then, and while I don't think we don't have a good measurement of the disparities as they hit different populations, the disparities in who got sick and who didn't, one can imagine that the wealthier, who at that point were more likely to be white landowners, were able to leave the city and go to Princeton, to Germantown, and across the river to other places.
So let's talk for a moment then about some of the other after effects of this. And David, I attended a few years ago, I don't know if you remember this, you had a kind of a living history event at the Lazaretto in Philadelphia, and there were people there in historical reenactors who were playing a role of medicine across time, not only from that time of the early 19th century, but across history. And there were a lot of children there and really learning, and it was really fascinating. It was the first time I had seen that kind of, most reenactments I've ever seen were Civil War reenactments, but this was like a care and concern reenactment, which I think we could use a lot more of these days. What is the Lazaretto, and why should people care about it now? Why do people reenact what's happened there?
The Lazaretto was not the first quarantine station in North America, but it is unique in that it has survived since its construction beginning in 1799. At the time of the yellow fever epidemics of the 1790s, Philadelphia, the Port of Philadelphia did have a quarantine policy, and it did have a quarantine station at the mouth of the Schuylkill River next to Fort Mifflin, which was sometimes called the Marine Hospital and sometimes called the Lazaretto. Lazaretto was an Italian word that was used to from Lazarus, the patron saint of lepers, that was used to designate the first quarantine stations and isolation hospitals in Mediterranean ports, beginning in Venice in the early modern period. So first in the 14th century, then 15th, 16th, 17th century. So the quarantine in the 1790s in Philadelphia was enforced very unevenly and ineffectively. After these 4 devastating epidemics within the span of 6-7 years, the city leaders realized that something had to change. This quarantine wasn't working. Some of the doctors claimed that the disease originated locally in accumulations of filth under certain meteorological conditions. Other doctors said the disease was transmitted from person to person and it was brought in on ships from the West Indies and could be stopped by quarantine. There was a vigorous debate and very bitter and unproductive debate over a period of years. Finally, a compromise emerged in which the newly established Board of Health decided, look, we're going to act as if both camps are correct. We're going to clean up the city, we're going to clean up the filth, and we're going to enforce a strict quarantine. In order to do so, they needed a new location, farther away from the city, to prevent contact between residents of the city and the ships and people who were undergoing quarantine. So the city purchased a 10-acre site on Tinicum Island in Delaware County, just downriver from the city, about 12 miles downriver, and established a big state-of-the-art quarantine station and resolved to enforce quarantine very strictly from then on. Beginning in 1801, when the new Lazaretto opened on Tinicum Island, through 1895, quarantine was practiced during the warm weather months of the year, which was the time that yellow fever was a threat. But yellow fever wasn't the only disease the Board of Health was trying to prevent. It was simply the one that had provided the impetus to create the Lazaretto.
The commercial interests of the city, I would think there'd have been some pressure not to do that. We're slowing commerce, right, by 2 weeks.
Yes.
Every time ships are coming in, some of those cargoes, you don't want to have to wait those 2 weeks.
Quarantine was deeply unpopular. Then, as now, everybody hated quarantine. Nobody liked it. The problem is, though, those same merchants who hated the delay and loss of money entailed by quarantine had also lived through the devastation of the 1790s. The only thing worse for business than quarantine is a yellow fever epidemic. So nobody liked quarantine. The sailors and sea captains and merchants and passengers who had to undergo it hated the inconvenience and the delay. Doctors were never particularly happy with it, thought it was inefficient. Politicians were always criticizing it, and yet it survived because, well, for a number of reasons. The city had to do something. It was an expression of resolve. It was an expression of the city's commitment to protect the health of the population. It was also a sort of err on the side of caution move. And after the new Lazaretto opened in 1801, indeed, the intensity and frequency of yellow fever epidemics dropped dramatically. Historians still aren't entirely sure why that was. It's, in my view, quarantine was one ingredient in that decline. It couldn't have been the only explanation, but I believe it did contribute.
I've yet to hear that historical analogy deployed in our discussions right now about some states opening and other states not opening in the United States. Maybe I haven't seen it yet. Have you seen that one talked about in this moment?
Which argument?
The Lazaretto discussion and the fact that government, this is not the first time government has had to try to balance competing interests around opening the economy and taking the larger concern of public health into account.
Well, that, of course, that is what everybody's talking about today. Now, in the 19th century, there were similar debates happening on a daily basis, but it was usually a matter of special pleadings. Don't detain my ship because it's coming from a port that was safe and healthy at the time that it left. Or don't detain my ship because the cargo is subject to spoilage and it's not the kind of cargo that could spread disease anyway. However, I think one can see similar patterns in the general push and pull of loosen up the reins, tighten up the reins. When there are signs of alarm, epidemics in other places, or illnesses aboard ships that are arriving, there's an impulse to tighten up the reins and an impulse for security. At other times, there's more of a sense of be flexible, let commerce flow freely, and until there are signs of alarm.
Michael, I want to bring the historical timeline forward and talk about 1918. And in fact, I have a question already in from Chuck Haas, and very good question. He's asking, to what degree was the 1918 pandemic treated as unprecedented? And he says, from what I understand, this was the first pandemic after the universal acceptance of the germ theory of disease. 1918 has been much more in popular discussion than 1793 or than the Lazaretto. And of course, there's a strong Philadelphia component to the 1918 story. I wonder if you'd be willing to share some of your thoughts about that analogy, and particularly this issue about how scientific understanding of disease had changed by then.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the wake of germ theory and the bacteriological revolution, there were all these illnesses that were, part of our society. They were endemic, right? We had tuberculosis and typhoid and other illnesses that would come and go. Nothing to the extent of the 1918 flu in terms of the devastation that it caused, both in terms of the economy and in terms of deaths. The epidemic has a particular resonance here in Philadelphia, and you can see behind me where it's a photo of the Liberty Loan Parade, which took place on September 28th, 1918 here in Philadelphia. And there have been cases of the flu. Many of the medical experts had warned the city perhaps not to hold this parade under the suggestion of the head of public health at the time, Wilmer Cruson. The parade went ahead. It was a patriotic parade. It was to raise funds for the war effort, and politics won out over public health in this case. And within days of this event, I think, David, it's about 200,000 people showed up to line Broad Street at the time.
Right.
And Philadelphia's hospitals were filled, within a week, and over capacity. People were essentially dying in their homes because of the rapid spread of this illness. We may remember back to just 6 weeks ago, when Philadelphia was preparing, like many other cities across the United States, to hold its St. Patrick's Day parade. And for a few days, it seemed, just as the pandemic was heating up here in this country, that the city was going to go ahead with that parade, even after parades had been banned in Ireland. I think Boston canceled first here in the US, and New York and Philly were slower to make that choice. And the historians around the city were apoplectic. You got to cancel this parade. We can't do this.
Yeah.
We can't do this again to ourselves. And as it turned out, Philly in 1918 was hit the hardest of any major city, because it did not enforce any types of social distancing measures until after the pandemic struck here with such fierceness. Other cities like St. Louis, which were much more thoughtful about this, had and enforced social distancing, had much lower rates of deaths from flu and the disease itself.
One of the questions that has been on my mind around 1918, and maybe we can use that as a way to come to the present, is, that is a pandemic that occurred in the midst of wartime. So in one sense, it has made it perhaps harder for us to see it historically because it's a compound of sort of overwhelming things happening in society. But there's a part of that I think is particularly relevant, and it has to do with the free flow of information, the degree to which people did or didn't know what was happening in the moment. And I guess I'd like to know more about that. If either of you could sort of say a little bit more about, were physicians and people in public health able to share information in that time? There were not a lot of news stories in the press in the United States about the pandemic, in part because of war measures to suppress bad news in the middle of World War I. Okay, leave that for a second, but were mayors communicating? Were public health officials communicating? Were doctors communicating? Or was this a case where lack of transparency and suppression really fed the disaster? I'll put that to either one of you if you know, because I'm concerned about how we're thinking about how information should flow right now about the pandemic that we're living in today.
Well, public health institutions were fairly well developed in 1918, and folks who were on the front lines were certainly alarmed. They knew what was going on, and they were communicating among themselves. However, as you said, Scott, this was wartime, and you don't mess with morale during wartime. And this is a problem going back. It's easy to judge in hindsight, to judge harshly public health officials or politicians who try to cover up the early signs of an epidemic, because we know what happened. We know that it did turn into an epidemic. It did turn into a deadly pandemic. In the early days, it's tricky. It's very difficult because particularly if you're aware of past epidemics and the panic and unproductive public reaction that have come along with epidemics, it's difficult to stand up there in the very early stages and say, we've got cases of yellow fever, of flu, of cholera, and I'm worried that it's going to get worse. There are very few incentives to do that in the early days, even though we would like, in hindsight, we would like everyone to have been courageous enough to do that.
Michael, do you have any thoughts about connecting that to our moment right now and the struggles of communication that public health leaders have found in this moment?
Well, I mean, what I would add to what David said is we just communicate so differently today, right? I mean, the channels of communication are so radically different. And, we can make arguments about, sort of the ebb and flow of scientific and medical authority, but we're living in this funny moment where, scientific and or medical authority can exist independent of sort of political whim. And we're living in this, odd time where, our president is promoting, drugs for the treatment of coronavirus that are untested and saying, hey, what the heck, we might as well do it anyway, to the astonishment of those in public health and medicine and in our world and in history of medicine and public health. And I think, the proliferation of ways in which we communicate has in some ways done us this harm. And it allows, any expert at any time to share ideas and perspectives in a way that, goes so far beyond peer review or sort of, a community assessment of ideas and opinions, that exist in so many places now that it's impossible to manage. And yes, it's true that, you know, people communicated in a variety of ways back then through pamphlets and you know, other ways to exchange ideas. But the ease at which somebody can claim to be an expert right now, I think is so damaging to our ability as public health experts to get out information that makes sense. I think the other thing is that because everything is recorded in real time and preserved and can be used as a cudgel against any of us at any time, something that we might have said 3 months ago or 2 months ago or 2 weeks ago may be different now and may have changed based on data, like face masks as an example. You know, like, you know, at the beginning of this, public health and medical experts said, don't use masks. You may, in fact, spread disease by using masks because you may use them wrong and think you are protecting yourself or protecting others. And now data suggests, you know, we'll see where that stands in another month, but data suggests that in public, we should be wearing masks. So I think the overwhelming nature of communication today is so different than what it was in 1918. And I think, you know, public health agencies are doing their best to both keep out in front of that, you know, tsunami of information, but it's a tough battle.
So David, it seems that in what you're describing and what Michael's describing, I mean, there are some key differences, but where the burden of the disease seems to be falling, at least where we're looking at it from today, there are patterns of vulnerability and inequality that once again seem to be returning to us in terms of where the disease is manifest. I mean, can you help explain that? I mean, I guess I'm asking you to explain the history of poverty in America. Sorry, it's a big question, but can we get a little bit deeper with that and understand why those vulnerabilities persist across time, even if we know that they have previously?
This is a really important question, and I think has been one that has been neglected in the discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, I'm constantly seeing everywhere, germs don't discriminate. Be careful, be safe. Germs don't discriminate. You know, and I understand the impulse behind that. Yes, it's true that anyone could potentially get infected with this. In fact, we have to face up to the fact that germs do discriminate. That is to say, infectious diseases do not affect everybody equally. They do not affect all sectors of society equally, and they never have. Each disease is different. Yellow fever is spread by mosquitoes, we now know, and anyone who's, you know, exposed to, you know, infected mosquito could get infected. However, you know, as I said earlier, in the case of yellow fever epidemics, those who could leave town were protected because they were out of the reach of danger. And in the case of every infectious disease throughout history, the impact has been unequal and has been felt most acutely among the poor, the disenfranchised, and the marginalized. And we're certainly seeing that today. And I think it's going to become even more clear in the coming weeks and months as we get more data. And the fact is that in many infectious diseases, simply being exposed to the germ is not enough to make one sick, or at least not enough to make one severely ill. It's the strength of the immune response that determines the severity of the illness and the likelihood of dying. And immune response is determined by many factors, but class, income, employment status, housing conditions, one's position in society, to a large extent determines the strength of one's immune response. Again, different in different diseases, but I keep being reminded today during this pandemic of a phrase that I'm borrowing from a colleague, historian Chris Hamlin of Notre Dame. Chris said, where knowledge exists concerning disease prevention and the factors that sustain life and health, the map of the availability of those factors is the map of rights that exist in a given society. I think that just says it perfectly. That captures what we know about epidemics in the past. And I think we will find, when we look at the map of deaths from COVID-19 in our city, in our country, and in the world, we will find the map of rights that exist in our society.
I want to remind people that you're listening to COVID Calls, and today we're talking about public health, history, and the pandemic with David Barnes and Michael Udell. Please do get your questions into YouTube live chat, or tag me on Twitter at US of Disaster, or email them to me directly. Michael, David's point about the social position as an indicator of immune response and the sort of map of rights concept that, as a way to envision where we're going to ultimately see the disease hit people the hardest. So I guess, to my mind, though, I can't blame Donald Trump for the persistence of petrochemical factories next to communities of color. How much of this do I put at the feet of the administration, and how much of this is something else about the way public health works in America?
Well, this is something, we've, in the public health world, we've obviously been thinking a lot about and seeing the way in which, in a similar way to the way in which history is playing out, we are seeing a similar playing out of historic health disparities. Can we blame Trump? There's a lot to blame Trump for. Historic health disparities are not one of them as they're situated in history, but for the way in which he has conducted himself in office, reinforcing the ideas that underlay many of those disparities, we can certainly lay some blame at his feet for. But I think what is, amazing to me, and it's something that, I've been thinking a lot about, which is the way in which public health in this country, certainly academic public health, has been, conducting itself over the past few decades in terms of investigating disparities and measuring disparities. Is that getting at fixing the problem of health disparities? And what is the distance between the work that we do as a field in terms of identifying these disparities and what we are clearly not doing in terms of pushing politicians and the public to address these disparities? And, Philadelphia is another great example, because we can look back to the sociologist and later civil rights leader, W.E.B. Du Bois, who came here fresh from his PhD at Harvard to take up a temporary position at David's institution across the street from ours, to conduct a study looking at the state of Philadelphia's African-American community. And he spent a couple of months walking the 7th Ward of Philadelphia, which is, basically the South Street corridor between, I think, 4th and 26th Street, or basically the Schuylkill River. And, as part of his project, identified what he did not specifically name as health disparities, but understood them to be just that, that were caused by poverty, historic racism, educational, housing, and other opportunities that were not equally distributed throughout the city. And he understood that unequal distribution had an incredible bearing on the health of Philadelphia's Black population at the time. So that was 124 years ago. And here we are, 124 years later, still trying to quantify health disparities that we know exist. And yes, the Band-Aid has been ripped off. Society's blindness for understanding that these disparities exist and plague communities of color because of racism, and plague different communities because of educational differences and housing differences, and job differences, and ultimately differences in income. But what is public health going to do now? How do we pivot to push society to really take up these issues in a way that leads to change? Because we could measure this stuff to death, which in some ways is what we've been doing.
I think public health is in a bind here. And David, I want to turn this to you and disaster research is in a bind here too, because the grounds upon which expertise makes its case in the public square is scientific grounds. It's the gathering of scientific consensus. It's the winning of grants. It's the founding of institutes. It's the publication of peer review papers. And that means a thoroughgoing scientification of social problems. And so no, I'm talking about like the world of emergency management here, for example. And that's the basis. And the assumption has been, if we attack this as a scientific problem, even something as messy as human behavior under stress, let's say, disaster sociologists have worked on that for 75 years. Mm-hmm. That makes it so easy for our political leadership to then take those findings and transform that into action, into policies. But the bind is then there's another path, of course, which is the path of the activist. And just to say, there's things here that are wrong, and we need you to change those things. And I don't need a peer-reviewed paper. I just know, as Michael was saying, I can walk these streets as Du Bois did, and I see the same disparities. I'm not going to give you your peer-reviewed paper. I demand change now. Maybe it's a false choice, but I just wonder what you think about this, because I feel like researchers have kind of bound themselves in a scientific space that doesn't leave a space for activism. And I'm not sure either, frankly, is moving the needle.
Yeah, no, you're right, Scott. The easy, obvious answer to this is, well, we need both. We need activists and we need scientific research. What frustrates me about public health is that so much of the work that is done on the research end, and so many of the initiatives on the policy end are disease specific. We see public health as the fight against specific discrete disease entities, and each disease has its own characteristics, and we fight each disease separately with different tools. And there are very good reasons for this. There are historical reasons for this. Among them, the bacteriological revolution. We discovered what truly caused disease, and what truly caused disease was not poverty or social vulnerability, but specific microorganisms. And so we looked for interventions that would target specific microorganisms. Mm-hmm. It turns out that the same people who are vulnerable to this specific germ are going to be vulnerable to other specific germs. And if you vaccinate them against this one disease, if you protect them against this one disease, that's great, but it won't protect them against all the other germs, all the other diseases. So what I would love to see is both activism and science that approaches public health from a non-disease specific perspective, and that looks at, for example, what can we do to improve immunity? What can we do to diminish the vulnerability of certain populations to all diseases? And that's a question for scientific research, and that's a question for policy activism.
I want to come to a question here from Patrick Roberts, which I think builds on our conversation quite well. I mean, Patrick's question is this, and he wants to situate it historically. What has made some people act with the good of the community in mind? That is, to follow public health advice, or to donate, or to volunteer. And if I could just build on that question a little bit, do we find historically that in moments of epidemic, pandemic, that pro-social response is an opening for policy reform? that there's some sort of continuation of that somehow. I mean, you talked about the Lazaretto, David, as a form of a response, or the foundation of the public health department as a form of a response, but presumably is building on pro-social behavior during and after disaster. I don't know. Either one of you want to pick up this question from Patrick Roberts? How do we build on the desire of people to help?
Well, the one thing that I would say is, for all of our anger and frustration and dread that we're all feeling right now, I think we are living in an extraordinary moment where most people are staying home. They're making tremendous sacrifices. And I think this is what you're alluding to. So how do we translate the goodwill of Americans into some type of sustained, not just policy response, but really fundamental change? We're not, we could talk about individual policies, but we're talking to some degree about reorganizing the way we think about our society. And the United States has always sort of drifted between these moments of rugged individualism and collective action. And that collective action has been seen in response to tragedies and wars, but it's also been seen in response to injustices, the civil rights movement and other movements for social justice that were coming to a close at the beginning of all the three of our lifetimes. And can we capitalize on this moment to create something similar to that? Because I think, justice for different populations who have been left behind or forgotten is really essential to this moment. I think, one thing that schools of public health might start thinking about is breaking down their disciplinary silos much more than they have historically, and to stop thinking strictly as epidemiologists or community health scientists or environmental health scientists, and thinking about how to attack problems across disciplinary domains to ignite some of that, at least from within academia. And then maybe also think about both training our students and maybe even creating departments within schools of public health that are departments of public health activism or politics. That's not going to solve the bigger picture problem that you were alluding to, but if I'm going to localize it to where I sit, I think those are some things that we can do. And I applaud my colleagues and you guys certainly too, who are out there having these discussions and pushing these out into the public realm. I think that's an essential thing we can do in this moment. But I think for fundamental change, there has to be some grappling with fundamental reorganization of different facets of our society. We have an election coming up in November with two very stark choices, perhaps not as stark as some people had hoped for, but nonetheless, there's a path. There are two very different paths ahead of us, and what we can do in that context, I think, will also help us into the future in one way or another.
But to me, this is very helpful because you've just given some very concrete things that can actually happen within the existing structure, in this case, of the university. I had Kathleen Tierney on a couple days ago, disaster sociologist who used to direct the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado. And she, her discussion is so similar to your discussion, but on the emergency management side. And she said this extraordinary thing. She said, I think we're at a point where we just need to realize that reducing vulnerability to disaster is going to require collective action. But I don't think she means by that we have to overthrow the state. I think there's a lot of different forms of collective action. I think this is to Patrick Roberts's point, that are happening in front of us all the time right now. Like, for example, most of America is doing things they don't want to do because they don't want to kill their neighbor. Mm-hmm. That's a form of collective action. But the question is, when we come out, how do we then solidify that into structures that have some longevity? Your Lazaretto behind you there, David, that lasted a century. One maybe small example, but I don't know. Michael has suggested a couple things. David, what's on your mind in terms of concrete things you could see emerging in this moment that might get us closer to public health serving the function you think it should?
Well, I think I echo what what Mike said, and I think in historical perspective, we can see in past epidemics innumerable cases of panic and xenophobia, okay, in which historians have abundantly documented these really terrible and unproductive reactions to epidemics. But we also see time after time something that historians maybe haven't paid as much attention to, which is solidarity, which is caregiving and volunteering. The Free Africans in Philadelphia in 1793 and in the other yellow fever epidemics, many other Philadelphians volunteering to help out and at great potential risk to their own health and safety. And I think we can see again today a tremendous desire. In addition to the panic and xenophobia, we see a desire to help. We see the New Yorkers out applauding the healthcare workers. We see really a desire to do something, and at this point, it's mostly unfocused and unchanneled. But in the coming weeks, we're going to need. I keep hearing about the number of people we're going to need to hire to do contact tracing, and that's not. You don't need an MD. You don't need to be a trained nurse or even community health worker to do contact tracing. You need a minimum of training, and you need bodies, right? And we've got, unfortunately, all kinds of people with nothing but time on their hands and lots of unemployed people that are going to be needed for contact tracing and other work. And I think there is a potential point of intervention. We're seeing this happen in South Africa today, a tremendously ambitious program of contact tracing to fight this pandemic. And maybe that's one of the potential points of intervention where we can capitalize on the will to help and create networks beyond professionals, beyond scientists, researchers, and healthcare practitioners.
This is echoed by my colleague and Michael's colleague, Esther Chernak, who's been kind enough to come on multiple times on COVID calls. And she calls this shoe leather epidemiology, and was echoing exactly what you were talking about there, David. And she's hopeful too that there are technological interventions which can be innovated in this moment too, which expands it beyond even the population you're talking about, but also potentially includes people who have other types of talents and skills who in this moment can apply them in that direction. I have one more question. We're up on time, but I do want to get one more question because this helps me bring you guys both back later, because we're going to talk about this now and we'll talk about it again. This, to my mind, this is a slow disaster. It's playing out over time. And I wonder right now, my brother asked me this, so I'm gonna ask you this. Is Dr. Fauci is there gonna be a statue of Dr. Fauci on the National Mall, or is he gonna get fired? And what he means by that question is, in the months to come, can public health hold its own in the overwhelming pressure, not just in Washington, DC, in many state houses across America, to let it go in one ear and out the other, what the public health officials are saying, and reopen the beaches and reopen everything else. So how effective, with all of the problems we just talked about notwithstanding, how prepared and effective are public health leaders right now to end up with that statue of Dr. Fauci on the mall and not see him get fired?
He may well get
first.
fired and end up with a statue on the mall, as a martyr to politics.
Right.
Mike, what do you think?
I was going to suggest something similar. I think that part of the problem with look, pandemics always have a political piece to them. But part of the problem with the way this is playing out is that it's not just political. There's, an anti-science, anti-public health, anti-medicine, and in some ways anti-human being current that is running through this response. And I think, Fauci has been there reminding the president and his leadership team that, if we reopen now, the disaster gets worse. If we reopen in the wrong way, the disaster gets much, much worse. We're not out of this for a while, but there are clear public health tools that once, we have, gotten through this first stage, that through testing and contact tracing, we will be able, as best we can, to create a new abnormal that's going to last for a little while. We will get back to our lives to some degree, but we're going to live in this new abnormal until either there are effective treatments, until enough people get infected that there's nowhere for the disease to turn, or there's a vaccine developed. We can't tell what's going to happen tomorrow. I mean, the latest data out of New York and out of California, there are a few other places with these high antibody rates, have changed some of the discussion already just in the last 24 to 48 hours. So I think we have to buckle up, wash our hands, stay home until told otherwise, wear a mask outdoors until we're told otherwise. Remember that there are a lot of people out there who are suffering because they can't afford to stay home. I saw a bus pass my house earlier, and the buses have mostly been empty, but the bus was pretty crowded today, which, I know that people are going and coming to work, but it scares me that not everybody can stay home and that we aren't having discussions about, basic income in this time, or rent suspensions and mortgage suspensions for many people. There are economic decisions that we could be making to make people safer as much as public health decisions. And I think we're lacking the leadership at the national level. We've seen some of the governors come together to start to address some of these challenges about testing and contact tracing, but there needs to be national leadership right now, and we're not there at the moment.
David, final point to you. Michael's called it the new abnormal. I hadn't heard that yet. I'm going to steal that and use that. I think that's incredibly productive and useful for us right now. What do you see in the coming months?
I do think there's a space for activism, for learning lessons. My number one lesson from this has been humility. I didn't share with you both the things that I was absolutely sure of when this started about epidemics and history, that I now realize I was a little bit too sure of. And so I'm going to try and hold on to that sense of humility, but also try to find an opportunity in this tragedy. And I think there's even a possibility at this moment to push a little bit beyond our deeply entrenched political polarization and speak with the people who are advocating reopening businesses, reopening everything, to find some kind of common ground for the future, because I really don't think that they don't care about human life. And I think this emergency can provide an opportunity for new alliances to be built. It certainly, at the very least, demands activism, continued activism, no question about it.
David Barnes and Michael Udell, we did not get to talk about cholera. We did not talk about AIDS. We did not talk about public health in other countries. And so my plan to bring you back later is going to have to be enacted. Thank you so much for this hour. It just sped by. And I want to remind everybody you're listening to COVID Calls. We are on every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And tomorrow, please do join me when I talk to Virginia Heffernan. She's been doing some amazing thinking and writing about the Trump administration, but also about governors and Governor Cuomo in this time, as well as disaster literature. So please join me tomorrow for that conversation. Michael and David, thank you both.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Scott.
Bye, everybody.